Hello, fellow bakers! My name is Kristen, and you may know me from my social media pages at Foolproof Baking. After collaborating for the past few months with my friend and business partner Matthew McGregor-Mento, I am excited to release the Foolproof Starter Jar Kit. This kit was created with a home baker in mind, and the meticulously designed jars that come with the kit are one of a kind and offer some pretty fun features to help you optimize your starter care regimen. In this video, I'll be diving deep into some sourdough starter background, everything you need to know to get your starter healthy and thriving. I'll take you through a 2-day refreshment schedule for the fresh starter included in the kit. And throughout the video, I'm going to cover my advice regarding starter optimization, and at the end, I'll cover tips and steps for Levain building that should be useful to you even if you're having issues with your own starter you've developed at home. Please take advantage of the links in the description below. I've included timestamps for each section of the video so you can easily jump ahead to the topic of interest. I hope you enjoy this tutorial, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. You know, I tend to think of my sourdough starter as a pet. I keep it nice and warm and fed regularly with a meal of just flour and water. It's actually pretty simple once you get the hang of it. A properly cared for starter can be maintained over many years and even passed down from generation to generation. It is important to note that a happy, healthy starter is truly the key to achieving a well-fermented sourdough bread. And this is the goal after all, baking up super flavorful, easy to digest, nutrient-rich breads. A sourdough starter is a doughy mixture of flour and water, and it supports a teeming, densely populated microbial community of lactic acid bacteria and acid-tolerant yeasts. These bacteria and yeasts naturally grow in the starter culture, originating from the flour and the environment. They ferment the sugars in the flour and produce acid, alcohol, and carbon dioxide, which acts to leaven or rise your bread dough. The overarching goal here is to maintain your sourdough starter in such a way that it is well balanced. This means that the bacteria and yeasts should achieve a harmonious symbiosis where the populations of microbes are competing for separate and distinct resources, where the acids produced by the bacteria are not allowed to build up to an undesirable level and are instead kept in check, and where the yeasts can thrive to produce optimal leavening power. I want to highlight that I'll be covering a 2 times a day feeding routine in this tutorial. This means following this guide, be prepared to feed every 12 hours, morning and evening, while the starter is being kept at warm room temperature. A 12-hour feeding schedule tends to be more manageable for people. However, I normally feed my starter 3 times per day, once in the morning, once in the early afternoon, and once before bed. And this really ensures that the acid burden stays as low as possible, and it gives me maximum leavening activity. For more on my 3 times a day feeding schedule, please see my tutorial covering this topic on our website at foolproofbaking.com. Now let's check out the kit. I've included for you all the tools you should need to help you refresh the starter packet and maintain an active sourdough starter with precision. You will find in the kit 2 starter jars specially designed for starter maintenance in Levain building, a digital scale for weighing ingredients, a silicone spatula for easy mixing, a graduated 50 ml scoop for feeds, 4 black rubber bands to help you keep track of your starter's activity, and a handbook filled with information and my tips to refresh the provided sourdough starter. The starter in the kit is a piece of my own starter, Ozzy, that I've spent the last 4 years painstakingly nurturing so that it is both fast-rising and robust. After only a couple refreshments, it should be ready to use in your bread recipes. I've always been on the hunt for a small, straight-sided clear glass jar of this volume for starter maintenance. I only use a super small volume for feeds, a process I like to call micro-feeding to limit wasted flour. These tall and narrow 9-ounce jars are perfect for this sort of feeding routine, and they also work great for building a levain for a single loaf. I'm going to slide a piece of paper in there so you can see the markings present on the side of the jar. You'll notice the jars feature a graduated ruler. This will help you super easily track your starter's rise throughout the ferment. There's also a temperature gauge to help you find the optimal temperature to store your starter. There's an area for note-taking. You can jot down with a dry erase marker when you last fed your starter or the ratio you used, as well as common feeding ratios for easy reference. The thermometer strip shows temperature indicators in both Celsius and Fahrenheit. The real temperature will be reflected by a green indication. Blue indicates the temperature is just above this marking, and tan indicates the temperature is just below this marking. For example, if your indicator at the 24 Celsius 75 Fahrenheit reads green, this is telling you your temperature is closest to this indication. Here's a strip indicating the temperature is around 26 degrees Celsius, 79 degrees Fahrenheit. And here's a strip indicating the temperature is at around 24 degrees Celsius, 75 degrees Fahrenheit. The starter jars, lids, spatula, and the scoop are all dishwasher safe, though personally I prefer to wash them by hand. If you notice some starter has dried out and hardened in the jar, soak the jar in warm water for a little bit to soften it up before cleaning. It should come right off after a brief soak. I recommend you begin feeding and refreshing your starter promptly after receiving it. I understand that's not always possible, so if you aren't able to begin feeding on the first day your starter arrives, just rest it in the refrigerator until you're ready to begin. Aim to keep your starter between about 72 and 82 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's a little cool, you could use a proofer box or a makeshift warming box, such as the inside of your oven, turned off with the light on and the door cracked to achieve a warmer temperature. If it's too warm, try finding a cool spot in your pantry, or you can create a makeshift cooling drawer with some ice packs placed nearby. Place the starter jar in your chosen spot for 10 to 15 minutes and check the temperature using the thermometer gauge on the side of the jar. In your kit booklet, you'll find this table, which offers some recommended feeding ratios depending on your observed temperature. So why is temperature so important? Well, warmer temperatures will cause your starter to ferment fast. You don't want to regularly underfeed your starter if the temperature is too warm, because then it will just eat through the food too fast and cause your starter to become overly acidic and sour and weaken the doughy mixture. Cooler temperatures, on the other hand, will slow down the fermentation. You don't want to over-dilute your starter with flour and water if the temperature is cool, because then it won't fully ferment the mixture in the 12-hour period. Note that the ratios listed are describing how many parts starter to mix with how many parts flour and water by weight. For example, a feed ratio of 1 to 1 to 1 means you'll want to combine an equal weight of starter, flour, and water. A feed ratio of 1 to 2 to 2 means you'll be combining 1 part starter, 2 parts flour, and 2 parts water by weight. I want to stress that this table should only serve as a general reference guide. Really, I want you to be able to think on your feet. Use the guide to help you understand how warmer and cooler temperatures affect the rate of ferment. Many things can affect the rate of fermentation and rise. Temperature, humidity, flour choice being the most significant. So these all need to be taken into account, and you'll need to choose the right ratio for your circumstances. If you notice your starter is rising too fast, then start feeding at higher ratios sooner. If you notice your starter is rising too slow, you may need to drop down your feed ratio. In all ways, it's best to focus on the starter itself, not the table. Next, you'll want to prepare the flour you plan to use for your feeds. I've always fed this starter with a mix of 90% King Arthur organic bread flour and 10% Arrowhead Mills organic rye flour. So in my flour feed bowl, I'll whisk together 450 grams bread flour and 50 grams rye flour. This 500 grams flour mix is prepared ahead of time, which usually lasts me a week or two if I'm feeding daily. Feel free to substitute other brands or other grains in your flour mix. You can also use 100% of one type of flour. All-purpose flour is a great option. Really, you have many options. I found that higher whole grain content, whether you're using rye or wheat for instance, can cause the starter to ferment faster and give your starter more of a tangy flavor. Using more white flour can give the starter more strength and sweetness overall. While changing the flour will change the physiology and behavior of the starter, it is part of what will make your starter unique. Now that we have our known temperature and our flour mix ready, let's start feeding. As I've already mentioned, I'm going to cover a 2 times per day feeding routine. This means every 12 hours, be prepared to mix together a little bit of starter flour and water in your starter jars. Each feed should only take a few minutes of your time, and if you ever need a day or 2 off, just move your starter to the refrigerator, and I'll talk more on this later at the end of the video. I will begin on the morning of day 1. Take the starter pack out of the fridge and gather together a starter jar with lid, the scoop, digital scale, and the spatula. You'll also need your flour mix and some purified or filtered water. Room temperature is great. Turn on your scale by pressing the on button and place the jar on the scale. At this point, you'll press the T button for tare, which will zero out the weight of the starter jar so it appears to be 0 grams on the scale. Open the starter pack by cutting off a small corner with a pair of scissors. Squeeze out just a small amount, a teaspoon amount, into the jar. The starter will be sticky. Do your best to measure out approximately 5 grams starter into the bottom of the jar. If you measure out 4 grams or 6 grams or 7 grams, it's fine. Just keep a mental note of this amount. Store any extra starter in the fridge just in case anything goes wrong with this refreshment. You'll have an extra chance to try again. I'm going to refer back to my table here. My temperature is about 77 degrees in my proofer box where I plan to keep my starter day and night. I'll use these ratios over the next couple days to refresh my starter pack. Note, if your temperature is between these, maybe like 74 degrees Fahrenheit, try a ratio in between, like 1 to 1.5 to 1.5. It's day 1, so I'm going to feed my 5 grams starter that I weighed out at a 1 to 2 to 2 ratio. Since my 1 part starter equals 5 grams, then my 2 parts flour equals 10 grams and my 2 parts water equals 10 grams. To measure out my flour and water, I like to use this handy little scoop. Place the scoop now on the scale and again hit that tare button so that the weight registers 0 grams. Scoop out about 10 grams flour from your flour bowl and add it to the starter jar. I like to be pretty precise, but if your number grams is off by just a little bit, it's really not a big deal. Scoop goes back on the scale and just make sure that the weight is still tared and the scale reads 0 grams. Now weigh out about 10 grams water into the scoop. I measured out 10.5 grams, a little off, but I'm not going to worry about it. Add the water into the jar with the starter and flour. Stir the 3 ingredients together using the silicone spatula. Usually this takes me about a minute of constant stirring. You'll want to stir long enough so that you have no dry bits of flour, and the whole mixture reaches a smooth paste in consistency. Make a mental note of this consistency, by the way, and also the smell. Mine right now is sort of thick, pasty dough, and it has a very slight aroma of tanginess and maybe some alcohol, but smells mostly like raw flour. You'll notice by the end of the 12-hour fermentation that the starter will change quite a bit. Affix the rubber band to help you gauge the initial volume in the jar and place the lid on top. Be sure it rests on there pretty loosely. You don't want to create any pressure in the jar, so get into the habit of checking that the lid is just resting on top. For this first feed, I'm going to rest the jar at around 77 degrees for the next 12 hours. I'll find a draft-free spot away from direct sunlight where the temperature stays mostly stable and check on it again this evening. 12 hours later and the starter got a bit of rise. The initial height of the starter was at 1 centimeter and it rose to 1.7 centimeters. So not quite a full doubling, but not bad for our first feed. I'm going to smell the starter. Right now, there's a more pungent, sour, and slightly alcoholic smell to it. These are normal smells at this stage of refreshment. Stir test for dough consistency. You can see it's gone more watery and syrupy. These are all signs telling you your starter is ready for another feed of fresh flour and water. We will perform this next feed. However, first I want to talk about sourdough discard. Whenever I feed, I discard all but a small amount of my sourdough starter. If you would prefer not to throw away your excess starter in the garbage or put it in the compost, by all means save your discard in a freezer-safe container and freeze it until you have about a cup or two. Use the discard in recipes like pancakes, muffins, scones, crackers, and biscuits. Hypothetically, if you never discard it, you will build up your volume quickly. In just a few feeds, you could be looking at gallons of starter. For the small-scale home baker, this is just too much. Discarding all but about 3 to 10 grams will help you save on flour and money in the long run. Okay, turn on the scale and grab your second starter jar. Place it on the scale, zero out the weight of the jar by pressing the T button. Using the spatula, reach in and scoop out about 5 to 10 grams sourdough starter. Note the starter will likely be pretty runny. I weighed out just about 8 grams of starter in the jar. Any remaining starter I'm going to discard into the discard bowl and get this into the freezer. Now we'll measure the appropriate amount of flour and water to add. Referring to the table, I'll do another 1 to 2 to 2 feed ratio. For 8 grams starter, use the scoop to weigh out 16 grams flour and add this to the jar with the starter. Then, again using the scoop, measure out 16 grams water and add this as well to the jar. Mix the starter, flour, and water together until no dry bits remain. You can use the spatula to pack the starter to the bottom of the jar. Place the lid on loosely, add the rubber band to mark this initial height, and I'll allow this to rest another 12 hours. Some great rise overnight. The initial height was at 1.1 centimeters, and the starter rose to the 3.7 centimeter mark. 3.7 divided by 1.1 equals 3.4x. Lots of bubbly pockets. The starter is looking quite happy. Give it a little smell. I noticed this one's more fragrant this morning, sweet and sour, and the alcohol smell has gone away. Checking for consistency using the stir test, you can see it's full of bubbles and more watery after the overnight ferment. Wonderful results after only a couple feeds. If you're super excited to start baking right away, and if your starter looks like this, you can certainly go ahead. See my tutorial on building a Levain. Refer to the day 3 instructions in that tutorial, or you can skip ahead to the end of this tutorial where I'll show you how it's done. See my basic open crumb sourdough bread tutorial, also available at foolproofbaking.com. For those who are still not achieving significant rise yet, don't despair. Some starters will take more time and some starters will take less time to fully revive, and this is likely due to shipping times, as sometimes it takes more time to get from me to you. Let's do a few more feeds to get the starter super active before using in a bake. I will also caution, though this starter is rising nice and high in the jar, it's taking 12 hours to do so after a small ratio feed. Part of a strong, powerful ferment comes from the speed at which the starter takes to rise to peak. So that if you do a 1-to-1-to-1 feed, you ideally want your starter to be able to reach full peak by 4 to 6 hours later. If it takes longer to reach peak after a low ratio feed, note that it will also take longer to ferment your bread dough. I like to keep up the refreshment feeds until my starter is rising predictably, but also quickly. This way I know I'll get the most efficient ferment on my bread dough. All right. To satisfy the now more hungry starter this morning on day 2, I'll be increasing the ratio I'm feeding. For one, it will take longer for the starter to ferment the mixture, which will be good to stretch out the time to peak to the full 12-hour mark. Second, by giving it a little more food, we will continue to strengthen the starter and keep it active and thriving. With higher ratio feeds, you'll want to ensure your starter stays contained in the jar after rising. So you'll want to use a very small amount of starter for these higher ratio feeds going forward, only about 3 to 5 grams or half a teaspoon volume. The easiest way I found to do this is to first place the clean starter jar on the scale with the clean spatula inside and tare the weight of both tools. So the scale should read 0 grams with the spatula and scale both sitting on it. Then stir your starter and allow some of that starter to cling to the spatula. Lift this out and place the spatula and starter in the clean starter jar. This should give you the weight of the starter only. Aim for about 3 to 5 grams. Choose your appropriate feed ratio for day 2. For my temperature, I'm going to do 1 to 5 to 5 ratio. So to the 4 gram starter I weighed out, I'm going to add in 5 times or 20 grams flour and 5 times or 20 grams water to the jar. Stir, add on the rubber band, loosely cover with the lid, and I'll let rest 12 hours. Throughout the day today, my starter went from 1.25 centimeters to 3.7 centimeters, or just about full tripling. It continues to get more and more active with every feed. Nice and bubbly, smells fragrant, and is not overly broken down. Things are looking on track with this higher ratio feed today. We'll go ahead and do the same feed as before at 1 to 5 to 5. Tearing the jar and the spatula, stir the starter and add to the jar just a little bit that sticks to the head of the spatula. Again, I measured out 4 grams. Adding in the 5 parts or 20 grams flour and the 5 parts or 20 grams water, stir, cover loosely, place the rubber band on, rest again, 12 hours. Super happy with the starter activity this morning after the second 1 to 5 to 5 feed. It's now over tripling in volume, smells sweet and lightly sour, strong in consistency. I would say this is optimized and fully active. Now you have a few options at this point. I'm sure you've got to be excited to get going and build a levain to make some bread, and this starter is for sure ready by now. If you're not quite ready today to make bread, you can either continue to refresh or you can move your starter to the refrigerator. I want to show you how to build a levain, but first let me give you some notes on these other 2 options. If I were to keep going with the refreshments, keeping up my twice-a-day starter feeds at warm room temperature, I would probably increase my ratio once more, this time to 1 to 8 to 8, or find a cooler spot to store my starter. This way, my starter won't over-ferment before I can feed again. While the 1 to 5 to 5 ratio peaked and fell before the 12-hour mark, note the sunken surface and hallmark residue on the side of the glass jar, a higher ratio of 1 to 8 to 8 did much better and didn't over-ferment in the same time period. If you have no plans to bake anytime soon and want to stop the twice-a-day feeds, you can store your starter in the fridge. I'd recommend taking a bit of the starter, maybe 10 to 20 grams, and feeding it at a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio. You can move the jar straight to the refrigerator, and then you don't have to worry about feeding for at least a week or 2. When you're ready to bake again, follow a similar strategy as covered in this tutorial to fully refresh and revive your starter from the fridge. Now, before I dive into how to prepare a levain, I want to take a moment to cover some frequently asked questions I get about levain building, as well as some tips to help you out. First, a starter and levain are essentially the same thing. The starter is the mother that you keep refreshing and propagating. The levain is the actual starter you will add directly to your bread dough. 2. I like to use the same flour mix as I normally use during the refreshments to build my levain. If you want to make a big change to your levain, I'd recommend taking a small amount of your starter and begin feeding a few times on the new flour feed mix to get the starter used to the new flour. Usually it will adapt and balance out quickly, but sometimes, especially if you're swapping a higher whole grain flour mix for one with more white flour, you might notice it takes a few feeds to get the starter balanced out and completely active again. 3. I regularly mix up a little extra Levain, and the reason is twofold. I often lose a little weight in evaporation, and I find it's good to have 5 to 10 grams more than you need so you can continue to feed the remainder in the jar to propagate the starter. You can build your Levain 1 to 1 to 1, 1 to 2 to 2, 1 to 5 to 5, or 1 to 10 to 10. If you feed lower ratios, plan to have your Levain peak and ready to use sooner than if you were to have used a higher ratio. What's really nice about a low ratio build is you can have your Levain ready to use in just 4 to 6 hours. What's nice about a higher ratio build is you can build your Levain overnight and have it ready first thing in the morning. The longer you allow your starter or your Levain to ferment, the more acid will build up in the culture and the more tang you might notice in your sourdough. So if you are looking for a sweeter flavor profile and more robust activity profile, consider feeding at lower ratios more often. Right when the starter hits peak, you'll want to feed again. If you're looking for more sour tanginess, consider feeding at higher ratios and allowing a longer duration between feeds. You can even stir down the starter to redistribute the microbes and allow the starter to further ferment to really boost tanginess. 6. The bacteria present in sourdough cultures produce lactic and also acetic acid. If you notice your sourdough is smelling or tasting more like yogurt, your starter is likely balanced more towards lactic acid. If your sourdough is smelling or tasting more like sharp vinegar, this means you're balancing more towards acetic acid. Generally, you can drive more of a lactic acid profile by keeping your starter at 100% hydration. This just means feeding equal parts flour and water, as we've been covering in this tutorial. And by keeping your starter at a warm room temperature, about 78 degrees. Acetic acid, on the other hand, is favored when you maintain your starter at lower hydration, meaning you would feed with more flour than water, and by keeping your starter at cooler temperatures for longer periods of time between feeds. Finally, I wanted to mention the action of enzymes, which become activated by the addition of water and lowered pH during the ferment. These enzymes can cause the breakdown of carbohydrates and grain proteins, including gluten. Thus, longer durations between feeds, even when using higher ratios, can cause the doughy mixture to degrade and break down. Overly broken gluten integrity means your starter will not rise as high in the jar because the gases produced during the ferment will more easily escape. This is part of the reason I like to use high-protein bread flour to feed my starter. You know, there is just so much to learn about sourdough starter, and as you continue to play with your starter, you will learn more about what conditions work best and what conditions don't work as well. Know that for established sourdough starters, like the one included in the kit, they're extremely resilient and robust, and they are very hard to kill. Have patience, keep experimenting, and have fun with it. I'm going to mix up some bread dough in about 6 hours, so I'm going to build my Levain at a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio and let it sit around 77 degrees. I'll combine 23 grams each, starter, flour, and water. Mix this up and let it ferment and rise to peak height in the jar. Now, instead of taking 12 hours to peak like it was doing on day 1, now the starter is able to peak within just 6 hours at the same ratio and temperature. Because this is a low ratio feed, you might note it will achieve max peak potential higher than usual, in this case 3.6x. Once my Levain hits peak, I can go ahead and add to my bread dough. I feel confident this starter is doing great and is going to give me a lovely ferment on this dough. Please visit foolproofbaking.com for additional information on sourdough starter, including troubleshooting tips and answers to frequently asked questions. I'll also have available full walkthroughs on how to make sourdough bread and an online forum where you can go to ask questions and discuss all aspects of sourdough fermentation. Thank you for helping to support Foolproof Baking, and I truly hope the starter jar kit can be useful to you, helping you become more in tune with your starter and achieve some delicious baked goods fermented to perfection. Happy baking!